This is what I call simply the SAE story. Many years ago, at the leadership school, the history of the fraternity was presented by wonderful Lauren Foreman, member of Georgia Epsilon class of 1901, who was for many years the eminent supreme recorder or executive secretary of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. And at leadership schools, he always presented the story of SAE as he remembered it. He was quite an historian himself. When he decided to retire back down to Georgia, he asked me if I would substitute for him and prepare the story of SAE the way I sort of wanted to do it. And I said, I don't know that I could ever do it as well as you could, Lauren, but I'll sure try. I've chosen 5 people. That's an arbitrary number, to be sure. 5 people whose very existence made such a difference in this fraternity that it became somehow a different institution because of their lives. They found it one way and they left it a very different way. Number 1, of course, Noble Leslie Devotee, who attended the birth of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. He brought it with all of its ideals and practices, after all, into existence. Harry Bunting, he presided over the incredible growth of the fraternity. You might call it its adolescence. Thirdly, William C. Levere, clearly the man who brought the fraternity into its full maturity. Fourth, Judge Alfred K. Nippert, maybe not as well known as the others, but one I think you'll see who made great contributions to SAE and who, by the sheer force of his personality, altered its character for the good. And finally, fifth, John O. Mosley, ritualist, author, historian, and above all, teacher, the founder of this leadership school. Were it not for that man, it is entirely possible that none of us would be here today. And now to our great SAEs and why they were great. Devotee, an Alabama boy, went to college as a freshman at a place called Howard College. It's called Samford University today. But after he'd been there a while, he transferred to the University of Alabama. We know the story of Devotee as he gathered his friends around him and as they walked down the banks of the Black Warrior River and planned out the fraternity they would found. He is the one who wrote the ritual. He is the one who gave it its name. He got John Barrett Rudolph to design the badge. He got 8 men, himself and 7 others together, and 7 of them were present at the first meeting, March 1856. Note in the minutes of the mother chapter of Alabama Mu that Devotee, though clearly the leader of the group, was one who said, "No, thank you, I do not want to be president of the chapter." Why? Why turn down the leadership of the chapter? He was looking forward. They said, "Well, what would you like to be?" He said, "I would like to be the correspondent of the chapter." That's the poor guy who has to write all the letters. I never knew an SAE who really wanted to be a correspondent except Devotee. In any case, why was he doing that? Because he knew that it was the correspondent who would try to see to the expansion of Sigma Alpha Epsilon beyond the University of Alabama. He knew he was not founding just a little local fraternity. It was to be a national fraternity, or minimally a regional one. And did he ever work at it? In the first 18 months of its existence, Sigma Alpha Epsilon established 7 more new chapters, all to be sure in the South. Remember the 1850s, a nation divided. When I was a pledge, while I graduated from the University of Tennessee, I pledged at the wonderful California Delta chapter at UCLA. And when I was a pledge, I remember going into the library to look at the founders' portraits on the wall. They all looked so old, but they weren't. Devotee, when he founded Sigma Alpha Epsilon, and when he graduated valedictorian of his class in June of 1856, was 18 years old. Don't tell anybody an 18-year-old can't do a lot. Devotee was the founder. Sigma Alpha Epsilon had a few chapters. It had managed to establish 15 chapters prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, or as they used to tell me always to call it in the South, the war between the states, or sometimes the war for Southern independence. In any case, in the intervening years, in the war, the fraternity very nearly died out. Why? Its chapters were all in the South. Virtually all of its members went off to the war. At the end of the war in 1865, only one chapter of the 15 that had been established was still in existence. The mother chapter was gone, as were most others. A little chapter at Columbian College, now George Washington University, was still in existence, and that was all. The miracle of Sigma Alpha Epsilon was that it survived at all. And yet, first at the University of North Carolina, then at the University of Virginia, and in other schools, one by one the chapters revived out of the death cry of war. Some of the boys who'd been a member of the wonderful chapter at Georgia Pi, at Georgia Military Institute, came back only to find after the war that their college had been burned to the ground in Sherman's March to the Sea. They had no college to go back to. So they went over to the University of Georgia, and on the last night of that year, the 31st of December, founded the Georgia Beta chapter of Sigma Alpha Epsilon at the University of Georgia, which today can make the proper claim that it has the oldest chapter of Sigma Alpha Epsilon in continuous existence. Those years afterwards were very difficult for SAE. A very strong aristocratic fraternity, but very small. In a South where Reconstruction was king, the South had a terrible time of it. And the universities and the colleges in the South had just as difficult a time growing and prospering as did the families on the plantations in the towns of the South. But somehow the fraternity managed with difficulty to survive. And by the 1870s and into the 1880s, it had maybe 15, 17 chapters. Along comes our second man, a remarkable figure. A youngster who'd grown up on, they called it a ranch in western Kansas, but because his two older brothers had entered Southwestern Presbyterian University in Clarksville, Tennessee, he decided to follow them and go down there. He was 16 years old at the time. This was in 1886. His name was Harry Bunting, and his older brothers were members of the relatively new chapter of Sigma Alpha Epsilon at Southwestern Presbyterian University. He was only 16, but he pledged Sigma Alpha Epsilon simply, of course, because his brothers were members and they wouldn't have it any other way. He and his brothers shared a sort of two-room apartment, you might call it, had a living room and a bedroom. And young Bunting, age 16, went down to the hardware store and bought a large wall map of the United States and a box of 100 thumbtacks. And he put that wall map up on the wall over the bed where he lived in this little apartment. And in that map, he put the thumbtacks, some where the SAEs had chapters already in the South, and others in schools all over the United States that he dreamed SAE might someday have chapters. And he said to his brothers, not only his blood brothers, but the brothers of his chapter, let the bounds of the fraternity be the bounds of the nation. Let's stop being a little Southern sectional fraternity. The next 8 years were phenomenal. Harry Bunting and his brothers founded or revived nearly 50 chapters of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. What's a tribute to them? Of those chapters, only one has ever died. He was absolutely incredible, and wherever he went, he could gather people around him and convince any of them in a matter of minutes that pledging SAE was the most important thing they could possibly do on the college campus. Loren Foreman was the one who used to say, Harry Bunting was absolutely amazing. That man could have sold rosaries to Southern Baptists. But he had to make a living, and after his graduation, and after a couple of years of working down in Atlanta on a newspaper, he decided to go for broke, and he went up to the big city of Chicago, right here in Chicago. And when he got here, stranger to the town, he met a young man in that same writer's pool by the name of Chester Grover. And he said, Chester, you went to college? Oh, yes. Where did you go to college? Well, I went to Northwestern University. And Bunting remembered that map down on the wall over his bed in Clarksville, Tennessee. One of those thumbtacks was stuck into a school by the name of Northwestern University. Grover had gone to Northwestern, and now he enlisted Grover to help him recruit students at Northwestern when they had a little free time. And they did precisely that. While they were covering some army movements out in the countryside, they had a chance to go into Northwestern just as the school was starting for the fall semester in 1894. And when they got there, they went to the actual corner. There's a huge oak tree still on that corner of where the Sheridan Road turns. And they stood by that tree, stood behind the tree, and watched the students as they went by, going in to register for their fall classes at Northwestern. And as each boy went by, Harry Bunting would say to Grover, well, who's he? He said, well, he's a Beta. And who's he? He's a Sigma Chi. He's a Delt. And there were already 7 fraternities at Northwestern at that time. And the next one might come by and he'd say, oh, he's a Barb. They called non-Greeks barbarians in those days. And Bunting said, well, is he really an okay guy? And Grover would say, yeah, he really is. Let's have a talk with him. And Bunting can get the young man, bring him over, say, I'd like to talk to you a little bit. And usually it took him about 20 minutes to talk the young man into becoming a charter member of the Northwestern chapter of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. He did this one after another as they stood there for 2 days watching the students come in to register and selecting out a few until they had 14 of them. And he thought, well, that's pretty good for a starting group. Let's go with that. And then down the walk came a roly-poly youngster, hardly the fraternity type, but a leader. His name was William C. Levere. He weighed almost 300 pounds, and he never drank, and he never smoked, and he never cursed. Not what I'd call a typical fraternity man at the time, maybe even today. In any case, Bunting asked Grover, who in the world is that guy? And Grover said, he's a real leader. Well, that perked Bunting up, and he said, well, let's have a talk with him. And when Levere became an SAE in Northwestern chapter, Illinois, Psi Omega was founded, he became almost automatically the leader of it. He stayed in Evanston. He had a distinguished career in Evanston. He did everything. And Bunting realized that now he could, in a sense, retire in SAE and pass the torch to this wonderful young man, Billy Levere. Levere did indeed accept the position, He was elected eminent supreme archon of the fraternity and re-elected. He edited an Evanston, Illinois daily newspaper. He was the city treasurer of Evanston. He wrote the 3-volume History of Sigma Alpha Epsilon, published it in 1910. He got an office in Evanston, which became really the fraternity's first national office. It was actually his apartment. When World War I came along, LeVere wanted desperately to join in the military because he was a real patriot. He wanted very much to be in the Army, and the Army looked at him and said, "You weigh about twice too much, and there's no way you're going to get into the Army." But he found out that the YMCA, which was very active, it did what the USO did during World War II. It supplied the troops with all kinds of recreation and a place to kick off your shoes and be comfortable in the course of the terrible time of the war in the First World War. And so he joined with the YMCA and went to France and spent 2.5 years in France serving the YMCA and serving the American military. When he got home, determined he was to take up the cause of Sigma Alpha Epsilon again. And in 1920, the fraternity centralized its operations, and indeed they centralized in Evanston, Illinois. 3 years later, he bought the land on Sheridan Road, on which most, I say most because it's another lot, of the LeVere Memorial Temple exists, and the house that was on that, the residence that was on that land, became the fraternity's central office. He called it this bit of promised land for Sigma Alpha Epsilon. Immediately, 1856, Sheridan Road, it did happen to be in the 1800 block, and so he insisted that the number be 1856, and indeed it was. LeVere continued as eminent supreme recorder down to the time of his death in 1927. He was the first chapter supervisor or E&L consultant. He edited the record. He did everything. We owe so much to him for what he did. When he died, Loren Foreman, the very man who gave this history before I came along, Loren Foreman was eminent supreme archon, national president of the fraternity at this time of LeVere's death. LeVere had a dream of a national headquarters building, and that building must also be a memorial to the fraternity's war dead. He felt so strongly about what had happened during that First World War experience of his in France. Foreman urged that the project go forward, and they would call it the LeVere Memorial Temple. But who was to be the chairman to see to the building of this national headquarters? And Loren Foreman said, "I think I know the man we want." His name is Alfred K. Nippert, the fourth of our great SAEs. He became the building chairman of the LeVere Memorial Temple. What about Nippert? Born in the United States, he grew up in Germany. And Nippert, as a consequence, as a child, grew up in Germany, and he learned to speak German before he learned to speak English. He returned to the United States with his family at the age of 14, went through high school in Cincinnati. He entered the University of Cincinnati in the early 1890s and pledged to the relatively new chapter of Sigma Alpha Epsilon there. He too was captivated by its ritual and its ideals and its potential. After graduation, he went to law school and ultimately became a federal court judge. We always called him Judge Nippert. He sent his son, years later, to the University of Cincinnati. The boy was the first legacy of Ohio Epsilon. His name was James Gamble Nippert. I mention him because in 1923, James Gamble Nippert, who was on the University of Cincinnati football team, on Thanksgiving Day of 1923, they played Miami University of Ohio in a grudge match. And in the course of the game, young James Gamble Nippert was cleated in the game. It didn't seem like a terrible injury at the time. Blood poisoning developed. And on Christmas Day of 1923, young James Gamble Nippert died. It was a horrible time for the chapter. It was a horrible time, of course, for the judge and his family. They decided, since the judge was on the board of trustees of the University of Cincinnati, the board had a special meeting right after the death of young James Gamble Nippert. And at the meeting, they said, we must give up football. We can't have this kind of thing ever happen again. And the judge stood up and said, please don't ban football. My son loved it so much. It mattered so much to him. And he said, my wife and I have been talking it over, and if you will allow football to continue here at the university, my wife and I will build a stadium for the university. And to this day, the stadium at the University of Cincinnati is the James Gamble Nippert Memorial Stadium. Then the judge and his wife went over to talk to the House Corporation of the chapter at Cincinnati. They were planning a beautiful new chapter house and said, the house looks wonderful, we like the plans, build it, and please send me the bill for it. I will pay for the entire house. Well, Loren Foreman had his man when he decided that Judge Nippert should be the head of the building committee for the LeVere Memorial Temple. Nippert got, as the architect, a Northwestern grad by the name of Arthur Knox and an SAE from Illinois Psi Omega. Knox lived at Evanston, and they began, with Nippert at the lead, to enlarge spectacularly the dimensions of the proposed headquarters building. And construction on the temple began in 1929. The values, the impeccable taste, the inbred traditions of Judge Nippert and SAE came together. Every detail of the building of that building he superintended. The magnificent German Gothic building, there was a consequence of the judge's collaboration with the architect, Brother Knox. It was surely to have a chapel that would be a memorial to the war dead of the fraternity. But that chapel, said the judge, must have not just ordinary stained glass windows, it must have the best stained glass windows that can be made in the world. And he knew where that was. Tiffany of New York is a name, to which you sort of stand attention. Louis Tiffany was a very old man, and the judge didn't just write to Tiffany, he went to New York to see Tiffany, to talk to him about making the stained glass windows for the temple, for the LeVere Memorial Temple. And as a consequence, they had a conversation, but Tiffany said, I'm retiring, I'm sorry, I'm done making stained glass. I can't take on that kind of a big job. It just won't do. The judge, again, is one of those people who would not take no for an answer. And he said, Louis Tiffany, let me ask you this. Is there ever a project you wanted to complete in stained glass that you never had an opportunity to do? And Tiffany softened and he said, oh yes, there's one. I came as an Italian immigrant to this country, and this country has treated me very, very well indeed. He said, how would have loved to be able to do in stained glass a history, a loving history of the whole North American continent. And the judge said, Louis Tiffany, if you will do the job that we want you to do for Sigma Alpha Epsilon, you may put that stained glass project in our temple. That was an offer Tiffany couldn't refuse, and he accepted. The consequence was the making of the magnificent stained glass windows. On the ground floor of the chapel is the history of Sigma Alpha Epsilon. On the upstairs of the chapel, open to the rest, is of course the history of the North American continent in stained glass. Of such value today, if you can imagine the value of a little tiny piece of Tiffany glass, when you have a whole room full of it, it's absolutely incredible. In any case, that the judge managed to get done. There's a great story that he used to tell how when he went up into what is now the tower room in the temple, he got to the top of the stairs and stepped into what has become the tower room. And it was very, very dark in the room. And finally his eyes adjusted to the darkness and he saw a spidery little man over in the corner laying up what looked like was going to be a fireplace. Well, the judge ought to know because he was in on the design. And he spoke to this little Scotsman who was laying up this fireplace, and he said, "How are things going?" And the Scotsman said, they're going fine. But he said, "You know, this fireplace that you have planned here is not the right fireplace for this room." And the judge said, well, then what is? He said, "You should build a Tudor fireplace." And the judge said, "Yes, I know what a Tudor fireplace is." "Oh, but why?" And this little man said, "When I was a little boy in Scotland, my sister and I used to go across the moor and we would go to an abandoned castle." And he said, in that castle, I'll never forget, in the great hall of that castle was this magnificent Tudor fireplace. And he said, I can still remember the phrase that was engraved across the mantle of that fireplace. The judge said, "Well, what did it say?" He said, "It said this: how can I warm thee if thy heart be cold?" The judge said, "Could you build that fireplace?" And he said, "You're damn right I could." And he did. And it's there. Well, they got the temple built and they dedicated it, and it had a lot of walls without the beautiful frescoes and paintings and all that are there now. And the judge said, "I want to find an artist who can do portraiture but also do this work on all of the walls of the temple." And so after the temple was dedicated, he took a trip, needless to say, to Germany. He said there were probably no artists in America capable of doing that kind of thing, but he was sure there would be in Germany. When he was just about finished with it, his last city was Munich, and he went to the Munich Museum of Fine Arts, and they said, "Yes, I know some artists, but I know one who's especially good. His name is Johannes Waller." And he offered him $150 a month and his ship fare if he would come to America and work on this wonderful project in Evanston, Illinois. And it is precisely what happened. And he came here, and Waller spent 11 years in the LeVere Memorial Temple before he finished all of his work. Now, the temple was built. On the Supreme Council of the fraternity, remember there were 5 members of the Supreme Council, was a man named John O. Mosley, the 5th of our great SAEs. He was eminent Supreme Archon of the fraternity in the early 30s, and the Supreme Council have either once in a while or frequently their meetings at the Supreme Council room in the LeVere Memorial Temple. John Mosley then had his Supreme Council there one day in about 1934, and he looked around him and he looked at his members of the Supreme Council. He said, "Brothers, you know something about this building. We have here a marvelous schoolhouse. Why not a school?" And they said, "John, what are you talking about?" He said, "A school to train our young people, to train them in leadership skills, to bring them together to talk about Sigma Alpha Epsilon." Well, someone said, "John, that's a great idea, but do you realize there's a pretty fierce depression going on right now?" And John Mosley, who at that particular time was in Oklahoma, said, "If you will permit me to go back home, and if I can raise the money to run a school, will you let me do it? And they said, well, if you can raise the money, okay. Well, he went home and he did it. Who was this John Mosley? Born in Okolona, Mississippi. He went to Austin College in Texas and graduated from Boston College and decided to go to the University of Oklahoma to get a master's degree in classical languages, in Latin and Greek. He was a marvelous student. He was rushed and pledged by the Oklahoma Kappa chapter. Brothers, if you think you can only pledge freshmen, let John Mosley be a lesson to you. Upperclassmen can be sought out too. In any case, he pledged Sigma Alpha Epsilon. Was he a good pledge? I think he must have been, because he was a pledge his first semester and he was eminent archon of his chapter the second semester. In any case, he did very well. He got his master's degree, won a Rhodes Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships anywhere, and went to Oxford University in England, Merton College. While he was at Merton College, now remember he'd been a member of SAE, when he was at Merton College, he saw the possibility of combining living together as a fraternity does, and as they do in a college at Oxford, and learning in the same place. He said, why can't our chapters be laboratories of learning, an experiment in corporate education? He came back to the United States with his degree from Oxford. He became the Archon of Province Theta in Oklahoma. He taught Latin and Greek at the University of Oklahoma and coached tennis. How's that for an all-around man? He was elected to the Supreme Council, and hence to Evanston, hence his meeting in the temple, and hence his dreaming of the leadership school. The boys came to that school, and the leadership school has never ceased. In 1943, gosh, it's a long time ago, I came to leadership school. It was the 9th leadership school. That was the middle of the war, and I was in the Navy, but I had 2 weeks of Navy leave, and the Province Archon from out our way conned me into using half of my Navy leave to come to leadership school, and I loved every minute of it. And I can say, at leadership school, run by John O. Mosley, I could sit at the feet of a master. John Mosley was terribly involved, as we know, in education. One of his dear friends was Judge Walter B. Jones. He lived down in Alabama, and he was the editor of the Alabama Baptist Quarterly magazine. And in that quarterly magazine, a contribution was made, anonymous contribution as far as he knew, and it was a piece simply called The True Gentleman. And he published it in that Alabama Baptist Quarterly, and he was so impressed with it that he sent a copy of that True Gentleman to John Mosley. And John Mosley thought, that is a magnificent statement, and he began to encourage its use in Sigma Alpha Epsilon. That's how it came into SAE, and in fact, most people in my day, we thought The True Gentleman had been written by John Mosley. We didn't know that, but we suspected it. Then, some years ago, I was visiting friends on the East Coast, and I stopped by the Naval Academy to see a friend. And while I was there, I went into the bookstore and all the stuff, the other things they had there, and I picked up a book that's handed to practically every Navy man, called the Blue Jackets Manual. And in the Blue Jackets Manual, on one page, was The True Gentleman, the identical words. And it simply said, John Walter Wayland. And thus I knew the name of the man who had written The True Gentleman. And we found out more about it was a consequence of a contest. Who can write the best definition of a true gentleman? Sponsored by the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and this man submitted his definition of the true gentleman, and he won a prize. And that's how the true gentleman got there. More recently, and some of our staff here at the National Fraternity have been very helpful in this. We've learned a lot more about John Walter Wayland. And fascinating as is, you had an announcement made with not only the consent, but the happy willingness of his descendants. He died in the 1960s. We are going to initiate John Walter Wayland posthumously in the fraternity because no man has made a greater contribution to Sigma Alpha Epsilon and never knew it than John Walter Wayland. That tells the story of our 5 great SAEs. You'll notice that nearly half a century has elapsed since the untimely death of John O. Mosley while he was ESR in 1956 on the eve of the fraternity's centennial. And during this half century, events and movements have deeply affected the colleges and universities of America and the fraternities that are a part of the campus scene. During these years, SAE has known many successes, has seen exponential growth, increased wealth as an organization, better communication through technology than ever before, but at the same time, we've come face to face with growing problems, some of which threaten the very existence of our beloved fraternity. In a way, too many of us have forgotten to cherish the traditions that have shaped the very best of what Sigma Alpha Epsilon is. Too many of us have looked around us and found the real aching concern for what we see that is wrong. But we have not possessed the courage too frequently to speak out about what is right and what is wrong. Too many of us recite the true gentleman, and we mean what we say, but too often have not had the conviction to translate those precious words into practice. As a consequence, our fraternity stands, I think, at a crossroads. We seek leadership, inspired leadership of the quality and durability that can affect healthy change, setting us back on the track set out for us by those 5 great leaders of the past. What does Sigma Alpha Epsilon mean to you and to me, to all those who don our badge as we enter the new millennium? When I think about what Sigma Alpha Epsilon really means, I cannot but recall an event that brought it all home to me, and not that long ago. At Simpson College, we have what is called a May term at the end of our school year, during which term the student completes but one course intensively. A number of times, I've taken a group of students to Greece during that May term, something I truly love to do. And I can remember vividly an incident that is one of the most inspiring, I think, of my entire long fraternity life. Several of the undergraduates of Iowa Sigma made up part of the student roster on that particular trip to Greece. Among them were our EA, and also 2 freshman pledges who had become eligible for initiation only at the close of the spring semester just before we left. We conceived the idea of initiating our 2 brothers, our 2 new brothers in Greece, that magnificent country to whose ancient culture we owe so much of what came to shape Western civilization. We were an awfully small group to undertake such an initiation, but we were fortunate to find a couple of young SAE alumni in Athens, natives of Greece, who fell in with our plans with enthusiasm. And at almost the last day of our month in Greece, we initiated our 2 young SAEs. And as a bonus, the boys managed to pledge a freshman participant in our study abroad group, a young man they had been rushing all year. As we stood there late in the day at the end of our ceremony, in the last rich rays of the day's sunshine up on the mighty Acropolis, standing in front of the Parthenon, we'd even gotten the Greek guards to let us come in after the Acropolis had closed that day. We stood there in front of the Parthenon, that magnificent edifice dedicated to our goddess of wisdom, against the deep blue sky, and so near the wine-dark waters of the Aegean Sea, all of us experienced something that it's very difficult to describe. For at that moment we could truly come to know what our fraternity existence was all about, what really mattered in our SAE lives. And you know, it had nothing to do with beating up on pledges or being super macho with women or drinking ourselves into a haze. Rather, it had to do with our caring for one another, sharing a magnificent moment, a magnificent experience that lifted us out of our ordinary lives, of powerful bonding with our brothers, of standing there in the almost palpable presence of Minerva, who is, after all, the goddess of wisdom, and who teaches us to think and thus do the right. Not because it's fashionable, not because it's self-serving or even helpful, but simply because it is right. That, brothers, I believe, is what Noble Leslie Devotee and all our other greatest SAEs were trying to say to us. And today, as never before, Sigma Alpha Epsilon is searching for leaders. You are participating in what is, after all, a leadership school. Leaders who see the need for powerful, even revolutionary change, and who have the courage, the fortitude, the dedication to Sigma Alpha Epsilon to effect that change. Who will that sixth greatest SAE be? Who knows? It may be you.